I walked into that church on a Sunday morning, knowing it would be the last time. Not because I had planned it that way, not because I had rehearsed some dramatic exit or written a speech in my head the night before. I walked in because my mother asked me to, and I had spent 31 years of my life doing what my mother asked me to do. The white dress shirt she had ironed for me still smelled like the lavender starch she kept in a blue spray bottle under the kitchen sink. I remember thinking about that smell as I sat down in the third pew from the front, right side, where our family had sat every single Sunday since before I could read. I remember thinking that no matter what happened that morning, I would always remember the smell of lavender. My name is Caleb Morrow. I grew up in Hargrove, Mississippi, a town so small that the gas station and the post office shared a parking lot, and everybody knew which truck belonged to which family just by the sound of the engine. I was the son of Deacon Raymond Morrow and his wife Patricia, who taught Sunday school for 22 years and made the best sweet potato pie in Rankin County. I was also the choir director's assistant from the time I was 15 years old, which meant I spent more hours inside First Holiness Baptist Church than I did inside my own home. I loved that church. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this story and make the church into a villain from the very beginning, and that would not be the truth. The truth is that church was the place where I first understood that music could move through a person like water through soil. It was the place where I watched my grandmother weep during a hymn and understood for the first time that crying could be something other than weakness. It was the place where I felt, genuinely felt, like I belonged to something larger than myself. It was also the place that nearly destroyed me. I think I knew I was different the way most gay kids know, slowly, then all at once, and then with a kind of quiet terror that settles into your chest like a stone you learn to breathe around. I was maybe 11 or 12 when I started noticing that what I felt when I looked at certain boys was not the same thing the other boys described when they talked about girls. I didn't have a word for it yet. In Hargrove, Mississippi in the mid-90s, in a Black Baptist church family, there was really only one word available, and that word was spoken like a curse. So I did what I imagine a lot of children do in that situation. I became very, very good at being something else. I became the best student in my class. I became the most devoted choir member. I became the son who carried the groceries without being asked, and who never missed a Sunday, and who read his Bible with genuine attention, and who prayed, every single night with real sincerity, for God to take this thing out of him and make him normal. I prayed that prayer for 15 years. It didn't work. By the time I was in my mid-20s, I had constructed a version of myself that was convincing enough to fool almost everyone around me. I had a good job doing accounting work for a firm in Jackson, 40 minutes from Hargrove, which meant I had a life that existed partially outside the reach of everyone who had known me since birth. I had friends in Jackson who didn't know my family. I had for 2 years a relationship with a man named Darius, who was kind and careful and who never once made me feel like I was a problem to be solved. We kept everything quiet, which suited us both. He had his own complicated family situation. We understood each other. Then Darius got a job offer in Atlanta and he took it, because he should have, because it was the right thing for him. I drove him to the airport on a Tuesday morning in February, and I hugged him in the departures lane, and I told him I was happy for him. And I was, genuinely, but I also sat in my car in the long-term parking garage for 45 minutes before I could make myself drive home. That was the winter I started to come apart a little. I don't know how else to describe it. I was 30 years old, I was living alone in a one-bedroom apartment in Jackson. I was going home to Hargrove every Sunday like clockwork, and I was spending the rest of my time in a kind of grey, exhausted silence that I told myself was just being introverted, just being tired from work, just needing to rest. My mother started calling to ask if I was eating. My father, who was not a man who called about feelings, called once on a Thursday night and said, "Son, your mama's worried about you," which in Raymond Morrow's language was the closest thing to "I'm worried about you" that he was capable of producing. I told them I was fine. I was not fine. What I was lonely in a way I didn't have language for. Not the loneliness of being physically alone, I could manage that, it was something else. It was the loneliness of being known by no one, of being surrounded by people who loved a version of me that I had built for their comfort. My mother loved Caleb the devoted son. My church loved Caleb the faithful chorister. My co-workers liked Caleb the quiet, reliable professional. And somewhere inside all of those versions was a person that nobody had ever actually met, and that person was starting to make a lot of noise. The thing about carrying a secret for 30 years is that secrets are not passive. They don't just sit there. They grow and they press, and eventually they find the cracks. My crack was a man named Pastor Gerald Simmons. Pastor Simmons had been the head pastor of First Holiness Baptist since I was in middle school. He was a large man with a loud voice and what I can only describe as a performer's instinct for knowing which emotional register to use in any given moment. He could be tender when tenderness was required. He could be thunderous when thunder was called for. He was, by any measure, extraordinarily good at his job. He was also, I came to understand, a man who believed that his position gave him the right to manage the spiritual and personal lives of everyone in his congregation. I had always had a slightly uneasy relationship with Pastor Simmons, though I couldn't have explained why until much later. There was something in the way he looked at me sometimes, something assessing and watchful, that made me feel seen in a way I didn't want to be seen, but I dismissed it, told myself I was being paranoid. Then the spring I turned 31, something happened that I still don't entirely understand. I was home for Easter weekend, staying in my childhood bedroom with the old Navy comforter and the shelf of trophies from the Junior Academic Bowl. On Saturday evening, I went out to pick up some things from the grocery store in town, and in the parking lot I ran into Marcus Webb, who had been 2 years behind me in school and who I had not seen in probably a decade. Marcus was, I don't know how to say this without it sounding reductive. Marcus was beautiful. He was also, I found out in the 15 minutes we stood in that parking lot talking about nothing in particular, recently moved back to Hargrove after a divorce. He was easy to talk to in a way that reminded me of Darius. At the end of the conversation, he gave me his number and said we should get coffee sometime, and I took the number and said yes, and walked back to my car feeling something I had not felt in a long time. I don't know who saw us. To this day I don't know if it was someone in the parking lot or someone who saw us through the window of the store. Hargrove is a small town, and small towns have a way of processing information faster than any algorithm I have ever worked with professionally. Whatever happened, by Sunday morning it had reached Pastor Simmons. I didn't know that when I walked into church that morning. I didn't know anything was different until I was already in the third pew, smelling my mother's lavender starch, watching the choir file in. I didn't know until Pastor Simmons stood at the pulpit and looked directly at me, held my eyes for just a moment, and I felt something cold move through me. His sermon that morning was from the book of Romans. That's all I'll say about the content. I sat there in the third pew and I listened to my pastor use scripture like a blade, and I understood with a clarity that was almost physical that he was not talking to the congregation. He was talking to me. When it was over, when the last hymn had been sung and the benediction had been pronounced, and people had started filing out into the receiving line, my mother touched my arm and said, "You all right, baby? You look pale." And I said I was fine, just tired, probably getting a cold. And she accepted that because my mother trusted me and because she was not looking for a lie. But on the way out, one of the older deacons, a man named Brother Titus who had known my family for 40 years, leaned in close to me in the aisle and said very quietly, "Pastor put your name in the prayer request bulletin this week for spiritual guidance." He said it without any particular malice. He said it the way you might mention that someone's car had been towed, just information. I stood very still. "He what?" I said. Brother Titus looked uncomfortable. "It's in the weekly bulletin, son. I'm sure he meant well." I took a copy of the bulletin from the table by the door, and there it was in the printed prayer requests section, between a woman recovering from hip surgery and a family dealing with job loss. Caleb Morrow, please keep him in prayer for spiritual clarity and resistance to temptation. I folded the bulletin carefully into quarters. I put it in the pocket of my dress pants. I walked to my mother's car where she was waiting for me, and I told her I had some things I needed to handle and I'd come by for dinner later. I drove to my childhood home, parked in the driveway, and sat there with the engine running for a very long time. I want to tell you that what I felt in that moment was righteous anger. I want to tell you I was furious, because furious would have been easier to work with. But the truth is that my first feeling was shame. Deep, nauseating, familiar shame. The feeling of being exposed. The feeling of being seen as exactly the thing you have spent your entire life trying not to be in public. And underneath the shame, something else. Something quieter and more dangerous. Relief. Because at least now it was out in the world. At least now I did not have to be the only one carrying it. I called Marcus that afternoon, not because I had some plan, not because I was ready to start a relationship or build a new life or any of the things that story would suggest. I called him because he was the only person whose number I had in my phone who didn't already know me as the man in the bulletin. He answered on the second ring and I said, "I don't know if you heard, but apparently half of Hargrove is praying for me this week." And there was a pause, and then he laughed, not cruelly, just genuinely, and he said, "Small towns, man, you want to get that coffee." We got coffee, we sat in a diner off the highway for 2 hours, and I talked more honestly to a near stranger than I had talked to anyone in years. I told him things I had not said out loud before. Not everything, not yet, but enough. Enough that I felt when I walked out of that diner like the stone in my chest had shifted slightly. Not gone, but moved. The week that followed was one of the hardest of my life. By Tuesday, my mother called me in Jackson, and I could hear in her voice that she had seen the bulletin. We talked around it for most of the conversation, which is its own particular kind of exhausting, the way two people who love each other can spend 20 minutes discussing everything except the only thing that matters. Finally, I said, "Mama, do you want to ask me something?" And she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Caleb, I want you to talk to Pastor Simmons." I said, "I am not going to do that." Another silence, and then she said, "Baby, I need you to tell me what's going on." And I said, "I know you do, and I'm going to, but not yet, not like this." She accepted that. My mother is a woman of enormous faith, and some of what I am is her, because she has always understood that love does not require immediate understanding. She cried a little. I could hear her trying not to. I told her I loved her, and she told me she loved me, and we hung up, and I sat on my apartment floor for a while. My father did not call, not that week. I went back to church the following Sunday. I did that consciously. I made a decision to walk back into that building not because I was ready to have any particular confrontation, but because I refused to let Gerald Simmons's sermon be the last thing that church meant to me. I sat in the third pew. I sang the hymns. I listened to the sermon, which that week was about something entirely different. And afterward, when most people had filed out, I walked up to Pastor Simmons and I said, "I'd like to speak with you privately, if you have a moment." He smiled the way a man smiles when he thinks he's already won. "Of course, Caleb, my door is always open." We sat in his office, which smelled like old wood and coffee, and the particular kind of authority that gets accumulated over decades. He had a large wooden cross on the wall and photographs with various public figures, and a desk that was too big for the room. He folded his hands and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as pastoral concern, which is a specific expression that manages to communicate both care and judgment simultaneously. I said, "You put my name in the bulletin without asking me." He said, "The church prays for all its members." I said, "You put my name under prayer requests for spiritual clarity." "You shared something private about me with the entire congregation." He said, "Caleb, I'm concerned about your soul. That's my responsibility as your pastor." I had thought about this conversation for a week. I had run versions of it through my head while I was making dinner, while I was driving to work, while I was lying awake at 2 in the morning. And in every version I had imagined, I came to this moment with either tears or rage or some combination of the two. But sitting across from Gerald Simmons in his oversized office, what I actually felt was calm, a stillness that surprised me. I said, "Pastor Simmons, you don't know what I am. You heard something secondhand, and you made a decision about me based on that, and you broadcast it to people who have known my family for decades. You didn't come to me, you didn't call me, you put it in a bulletin." He started to speak, and I held up one hand, not aggressively, just firmly, and I said, "I'm not finished." He stopped. I said, "I have been a member of this church since before I could walk. My family has given to this church their time and their money and their faith for as long as I've been alive. I have spent 15 years in this choir. I have never in all of that time asked for anything from this congregation except to be allowed to worship alongside them. And the first time you thought you had information about who I am, the first thing you did was put it in print." He said, "I was trying to help you." I said, "No, you were trying to manage me. There's a difference." He leaned forward then, and his voice dropped into that lower register, the pastoral thunder. He told me that what he was concerned about was sin, that the church's position was clear, that he loved me as a brother in Christ, and that was exactly why he couldn't stay silent, that he hoped I would come to him for counseling, and that the congregation would stand behind me if I chose to walk the right path. And I listened to all of it. I let him finish. And then I said, "I know what this church teaches. I have known it since I was a child. I have prayed against myself every night for 15 years based on what this church taught me. I am 31 years old, and I have never been in a relationship that I didn't have to hide, and I have never been fully known by anyone in this congregation, and I have spent more time afraid in this building than at peace in it. And I genuinely think, that God is not the author of that kind of fear." He looked at me for a long moment, then he said, "I'll pray for you, Caleb." I said, "I know you will." I stood up. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. "I'll pray for you too, Pastor." I walked out of his office, and down the hall past the Sunday school classrooms, and the fellowship hall and the bulletin board covered in paper hand turkeys left over from the children's Thanksgiving program. I walked out through the side door of First Holiness Baptist Church, and into the parking lot and the sharp, bright air of a Mississippi Sunday morning. I did not go back the following week, or the week after that. What I did do was call my mother and ask her to come to Jackson for dinner. She came on a Wednesday evening, which was unusual. My mother treated weekdays as belonging to the routine of life and Sundays as belonging to God, and Wednesday was right in the middle of both. She drove herself, which she preferred. She brought sweet potato pie in a dish covered with foil. We ate dinner and talked about small things for a while, and then I turned off the television and sat across from her at my small kitchen table, and I told her the truth. All of it, the whole truth. Not in fragments or around the edges, but directly, clearly, starting from when I was 12 years old and ending with the conversation in Pastor Simmons's office. She didn't say anything for a long time. She looked at the table. She looked at her hands. She looked up at me, and I could see her doing something internal, working through something, and I sat and let her do it without filling the silence. Finally she said, "How long have you been carrying this by yourself?" I said, "Most of my life." She put her hand over mine on the table. She didn't say anything theological or corrective. She didn't tell me she needed time. She said, "You should have been able to tell me sooner. I'm sorry you couldn't." I don't have adequate words for what that felt like. I've tried to find them and I can't. What I can tell you is that something that had been locked for 30 years, something I had stopped believing would ever open, came loose in that moment. And I cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was a small child, not politely or quietly, but in the way that your whole body participates. And my mother held onto me across the kitchen table and didn't say a word about fixing it or changing it or what it meant for anything. She just held on. My father took longer. I knew he would. Raymond Morrow is a man who processes things privately and silently and in his own time, and there is no rushing him. He did not call me for 3 weeks after my mother told him. I gave him those 3 weeks without pressure, which was hard but necessary. When he finally called, it was on a Saturday morning, and he said, "You want to go fishing this weekend?" which was his version of "I'm ready to talk." We fished. We didn't talk about it directly for most of the morning, which was also very much him, and I accepted that because I know my father. He communicates through presence. The fact that he was there, standing beside me on that bank with his line in the water, was the communication. Around noon he said, without looking at me, "Are you happy?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "I'm getting there." He nodded. He pulled in his line and recast it. He said, "That's all I ever wanted for you." And then he didn't say anything else about it for the rest of the day. It was enough. Marcus and I have been together for 8 months now. It is not a secret. Not in Jackson, not in Hargrove, not anywhere. We are not loud about it. Neither of us is particularly loud by nature, but we are not hidden, which is a distinction that matters enormously to me. My mother has met him twice. The second time, she complimented his manners, which in Patricia Morrow's language is as close to approval as a first impression gets. I have not returned to First Holiness Baptist. I don't know if I will. That's a question I'm still sitting with, and I've made my peace with sitting with it rather than forcing an answer. What I have done is find a small affirming church in Jackson that meets in a converted storefront on Thursday evenings, with mismatched chairs and a praise band that is enthusiastic if not always technically precise, and a pastor who quotes James Baldwin alongside scripture. I go most weeks. I don't feel the same there as I felt at First Holiness. It is a different kind of church. A different kind of community, but I feel something. I feel safe, which is not a small thing. I think about the Bulletin sometimes. That folded piece of paper in my pants pocket, with my name printed between a hip surgery and a job loss, announced to an entire congregation as a problem in need of prayer. I thought for a long time that it was the worst thing that had happened to me. Then I started to think it might have been the thing that made the rest possible. Not because I'm grateful for Gerald Simmons's particular understanding of pastoral care. I am not. But because that morning in the third pew was the last morning I sat in silence about who I was, and everything that came after, the coffee with Marcus, the conversation with my mother, my father and his fishing pole, the storefront church on Thursday evenings, all of it flows from that moment of exposure. There is a version of my life where that Bulletin never got printed, where I continued to manage my own silence indefinitely, going home every Sunday in the lavender-starched shirt, loving a church that would not have loved me back if it had known me fully. I am not sure that version of me would still be here. I mean that plainly and without drama. I am here, I am known. Not by everyone, not by every place I have ever loved, but by the people who matter and in the spaces where I can breathe. That is not everything I once hoped for. It is more than I once believed I would get. Last month, I was sitting in the storefront church on a Thursday evening when the praise band started a hymn I recognized from my childhood, one of those old standard hymns that gets sung in every Black Baptist church in the country. I knew every word without thinking. I sang it in that mismatched chair room with strangers who were becoming less like strangers, and I felt it move through me the way music moves through a person when they are not performing it but actually living inside it. I thought about my grandmother crying in the pew at First Holiness. I thought about what I understood that day, that crying can be something other than weakness. I thought, I am still that child. I am also someone that child could not have imagined. Both of those things are true at the same time, and I have stopped needing them to resolve into something simpler. The lavender smell is still there somewhere. Some things stay with you. The rest you learn to carry differently.